This video is all about React event handling. How do we handle and respond to user interactions in the React ecosystem? At the end of this lesson, you will be able to respond to events triggered by user interaction using event handlers. Okay, so the question that we're going to ask ourselves right now, what is a DOM event? The answer to that is anytime a user interacts with a DOM element. So this could be a click, a mouse enter, a mouse leave, an input change, double clicks, key presses, scrolls, scroll tos, all these types of things are events. These are things that you do day in and day out when it comes to interacting with web pages. Okay? So events are the things that you do as a user interacting with web pages. Events are fired and triggered within a browser window and are attached to specific elements that reside within it. Okay? And the cool thing is that most languages actually have some sort of event model built into the language. JavaScript has our event model built into the language in the browser context. That event model is actually a little bit different than the events that may or may take place in a may or may not take place within a node environment. So things behave differently than you may expect them to between JavaScript that runs on the browser and JavaScript that runs in a Node.js environment. So that's kind of maybe something you didn't know. If HTML and CSS are the architecture and the design of a house, a building per se, JavaScript then is the electricity that enables us to interact with it. So these types of interactions that we interact with throughout our house would be considered events. The things that we're talking about again here are when a user clicks on something, when a user scrolls to something, when a user does anything that they interact with our code in any certain way. Okay, so let's look at what a native JavaScript and HTML-esque style event would look like. Notice from this example, we have a button that we have built, const button equals document.querySelector, find the button on the screen, okay, the button element. Then we can actually make that button add an on-click event. So that button itself, by default, in JavaScript has an on-click event. Or in HTML, it has an event that it's listening for clicks. If a user clicks on it, then do something. If a user clicks on a button that has an event handler attached to it, then whatever is found in that handler will be the logic or the operation that's to take place. In this case, we have a background change function. That function will create a random RGB value and based on the assignment given to the numbers there, and it will create a value of some color, okay, an RGB value color. Okay, and then we say document.body.style.background color will equal that constant that we create from that function. Now here's what's super cool about this. We can then say select that button by calling btn and find that attribute on click and assign it to the function that we created, bgchange. Okay, so in this case, we kind of have a component architectural pattern here. We've selected some button from the screen. Okay, in JavaScript or in React, it's going to look a little different. We're going to select the JSX and we're going to put these events on JSX directly, which is what's super nice. You don't have to do all of this. You just have to write your logic and then pass it to your JSX element as an attribute or a prop. Okay. Now, how is it different in React from the DOM? In React, the event object that will be passed around through the event loop will actually be wrapped in what's called the synthetic event. Okay. Objects are pooled, so all of our events are pooled in React. So that this event object can be used by various other types of DOM elements and their events. So there could be an on-click event, but it will be pooled into the same object. You don't need to know the inner workings of how that is designed, but that is by design in React synthetic event object. This is done to help with performance. And events are completely custom in React. So React has a lot more control over the events, what gets fired, how they get fired, what events bubble, what events pool, all of these types of random jargon that you don't need to know too much about. But you just need to know that the React event is different than the actual event object. Okay. Now, what does this look like in terms of what we're going to be building and function handlers and whatnot? So what's cool about this is this following piece of handle click function code is going to actually, the first time it's going to log null. This is that pooling problem in React. Okay. So the first time that this handle click function gets called, what's going to log out is null. So what we do to fix that is we store the event's property that we're interested inside of its own binding, meaning its own lexical scope. So in the second function's case, we have cached the event.target.name inside of a value called name. Because at the time that this event runs, a second later in that set timeout in the first function, that event.target.name has already been used and reused by potentially another event. Okay? So that's the idea here. Events behave significantly different in JavaScript than they do React, and it's because React wrapped the synthetic event around the actual event object. Start by creating a few elements on this page here that will be JSX elements, but eventually they'll make their way into DOM elements, okay? So we're going to create a couple of buttons. We'll call this single click handler. Okay. We'll create a couple more, maybe just a double click. I'll create a div because divs have events or can have events. And we'll do mouse enter. We'll do a mouse leave on this div. And then some input, which is one of the more important elements that you will use as a front-end developer, whose type is going to be text, and whose placeholder will be some text that we define here. So just watch me for a second while we wire up a couple of these items, and then I'll have you actually pause the video and go grab a URL from Training Kit and follow along with me there. So just watch this portion, and then I'll tell you when to follow along. So the placeholder is going to be change me. Okay. So if I save the page, then this will refresh. We get our button, our couple of divs, and our little change me input field. So the first thing that I want to do is I actually want to bind an event onto the button that has said single click handler. Okay. So the way that we're going to do this in React, since we are in classes, we can actually use advanced JavaScript features. And one of those advanced JavaScript features is to basically declare your methods on your classes by using arrow functions as opposed to the previous syntax. Okay. So I can declare a handle single click event as an arrow function like this. And this syntax, what it's doing is it's saying, take this handler function and bind it to the class app, okay, as a method. So when I instantiate this app as a method, what's going to happen is we are going to get this as a method on the instantiated object, okay? And that's just, all that is to say is that now we can use the arrow function on our classes, on our class methods, and then we don't have to do any explicit binding, any binding with the this keyword. This automatically will allow it to use the this keyword that is referred to inside of app, which it's a big deal because now inside of this render function, we can just select the app by saying this dot handle single click event and putting it on our DOM element, okay? But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to return an alert call, okay? And that alert call is just going to simply say single click event triggered, okay? If I save that, we're going to, nothing's going to happen yet, but we need to bind it up to our button, okay? So here on the button now, I'm going to on click, and assign it to this dot handle single click event. And if you notice, the IntelliSense was kind of clicking in, so you could have just auto-completed that. So now this button should have a function bound to its click handler. If I was to look at this inside of the DOM, and I was going to right click and inspect this element, I could go to that element and I could say, oh, I want to see the event listeners that are on that element. And if you notice, there is a click handler, and we have this button and we have this handler function that is ready to roll with me. Okay. All right, so let's see what happens when we actually click on that button. And notice single click event triggered gets alerted to the console. We also have the ability to do this on all these other types of events. Okay. So now it's your turn to follow along with me. So pause the video. Make sure you go to Training Kit and find this URL inside of the module, class components, inside of the objective, learn to respond to events triggered by user interaction and handle user input via forms. Okay. So make sure you go and find it there inside of the challenge or inside of the follow along section. It'll be at the top of the follow along section in there. So once again, I'll have a link. I can make a link to this in our in the description of this video, so it's easy for you to find as well if you'd like. Okay. All right, so let's dive in and let's now go ahead and follow along with me. We're going to repeat this process and we're going to create a function handler that is going to essentially be triggered on double click. Okay, so I'm going to say handle double click event, and it's going to alert and say single click or double click event triggered. Better not have any typos. And just like before, we're going to bind that to our onClick event. Notice that it's camel cased, whereas in JavaScript and HTML, it would be all lowercase. So I'm going to save that file, and notice that if I click this button, it still does its single event triggered. If I click this one, I must have double clicked it there on accident. Oh, this should be on double click. Okay, so I'm going to save that. And if I now click on it once, it's not going to fire. If I go and click on it again, it's not going to fire. But if I double click on it, it'll fire that event. So double click event is kind of a fun one for double clicks. You make sure that you have a double click on an item. Cool. So I want you to go ahead and repeat this process for mouse enter and mouse leave. So go ahead and pause the video and try and do it on your own through this code sandbox so that you can figure out how to mouse enter and mouse leave. It'll be essentially the same logic as we did for these above, for these events above, but make sure that you do it for the mouse enter and mouse leave events. So pause the video, do it on your own. When you come back, we're going to do a solution for it. Okay, so now we're going to solve that mouse event, enter event. If you go and you say handle mouse enter, it'll be the same thing, alert. Okay, normally you wouldn't want to just alert here. Normally you would respond to this and do something with that event, okay, which we're going to show you at the end of this video. And I will do the same thing virtually for mouse leave. Okay, then I'll grab these, put them down here and say mouse enter this dot, and then I'm going to do this one is going to be on mouse leave. And it's on mouse enter and on mouse leave that you want this to reside on those events. Remember, this is how we're binding those events to our elements in JSX, right? These are the events. We bind them to our elements this way. So if I go and then I say mouse enter on that div, mouse enter event triggered. If I go and enter the div here, and then leave it, it should trigger on leave. Pretty fun. Okay, now that you did those on your own, you're pretty much set up and squared away for almost any event in JavaScript or in React. But now we're going to respond to an onChange event on the input field. And this is one that I want you to sort of watch and soak it all in, and then try and rinse and repeat and do it on your own as well. Okay, so this input field, input type text, is going to have an onChange event that's going to pass an event. We're just going to say handle input change. And we're going to create that as a function above. That is a method using this new syntax. So I'm going to open up a function block, because what we want to look at here is the e.target, we're going to call it the event target.value. Okay? At the time that this function is fired, an event will be passed through this function as an argument. That event is going to be the React synthetic event. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to see what the value of the targeted element, whoops, I did a mouse leave, the targeted element, which is this input field, will be at the time that a user types into the input field itself. So the event is the object that will get passed through. The target is what element it was triggered upon, and then the value is the value that is found inside of the input field as we type. So if I pull up our little console here in Code Sandbox and I start typing, you'll see that what we get is the representation of that value found in that input field. Okay, now here's what's super cool. And this is your next process. Okay, this is your next step in the process, is to take this idea. Okay, and I want you to save the event target value on state, a variable of your choice. So we'll just say save it as message. Okay, so that means you're going to need to come up here and create a constructor function, call super this.state, and add some message prop. It's going to be an empty string at first. Okay, now you're going to call this.setState and make sure that you assign that message to the event.target.value. So pause your video, make sure that your app is just like this and ready to go, and then make sure that you set the state of the message that's found on state to the event target value. Okay, so pause the video and make sure you do it on your own, and we'll come back. Okay, welcome back. So we're going to solve that little problem. If you were able to try and get it to work, that's great. If not, that's great too. You're going to get a solution to it right now. Now we're just going to assign message, since we're going to target message on the setState function as event.target.value. Okay, so if I were to then bind myself up to this message, instead of saying event handlers here, I could say this.state.message, and I could start typing in that input field, and I could say hello from the inputs value. And instantaneously we have data that's bound up through this component. So that is the basic overview of how to respond to events that are triggered by user interaction inside of our React applications. Okay, and we also covered something that we're going to be talking about at length in the next exercise, is how do we then set the state of that event onto some message that's given to us, or onto some item that we want it set. And we're going to be going over set state at length over the coming topics. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this little session. Please play around with this, try and create some more inputs and try and get them to be reusable, and play around with the ability that you have. There's also a challenge in Training Kit for you to go over this little project again.